Imagine stepping into a world where the sun disappears for months, where the wind howls like a beast tearing across the frozen seas, and where every breath feels like shards of ice scraping your lungs. Yet somehow, against all logic, entire villages of Viking settlers not only survived, but thrived, in these brutal Arctic winters. Their wooden homes stayed warm, their food never spoiled, their livestock lived, and their children played outside while similar settlements in other parts of the world collapsed under the same conditions. How did they do it? How did Viking villages never freeze, even in the deadliest, darkest winters the North had ever seen? Tonight you're going to travel back more than 1,000 years, crossing frozen fjords, smoky longhouses, and snow-choked forests, to discover the forgotten secrets that kept the Vikings warm when the world turned to ice. The story begins with a single moment, a Viking scout standing on the edge of a fjord in the year 865 CE. Snow is falling thick enough to bury footprints in seconds, the sea is half frozen, and the wind slices through fur clothes like knives. Yet down in the valley below, the settlement of J with acute RNFJR glows like an ember in the night. Smoke rises from the rooftops, orange light spills from windows made of old animal hides, and even from far away, the scout can hear the muffled hum of people talking, laughing, and living as if winter were nothing but a minor inconvenience. This contradiction, this impossible warmth, was no accident. It was the result of thousands of years of adaptation, invention, and cultural secrets passed down like sacred knowledge. To understand why Viking villages never froze, you first need to understand what the Viking winter actually meant. Arctic winter wasn't just cold. It was a monster, temperatures dropping to -40, storms that buried entire houses, sea ice stretching hundreds of miles, and snow so heavy it crushed roofs. But the Vikings weren't afraid. They prepared for winter like modern people prepare for war, strategically, methodically, and with absolute seriousness. A Viking didn't simply wait for winter. They hunted it, studied it, and learned to bend it to their advantage. Their first secret was their homes. Viking longhouses weren't ordinary wooden huts. They were engineered marvels, built with thick turf walls that could trap heat for days. Imagine layers upon layers of earth, grass, timber, moss, and animal skins all pressed together to create a natural insulation stronger than most modern cabins. When snow piled against the outer wall, it didn't freeze the house, it insulated it even further. Snow became a thermal blanket. The Vikings didn't just survive the cold, they used it. Inside these longhouses, fires burned slowly in stone hearths, sending warm air drifting upward into rafters blackened by centuries of smoke. Instead of chimneys, many homes had only a small smoke hole, which meant the heat stayed trapped inside like an oven. The walls stayed warm, the floors stayed warm, and even the benches people slept on radiated stored heat late into the night. And the smell, wood smoke mixed with pine resin, dried fish, wool, and warm earth, created a sense of safety no blizzard could penetrate. Another secret lay beneath the ground. Many Viking villages were deliberately built near geothermal hotspots, warm springs, volcanic rocks just beneath the soil, or naturally heated water sources that never froze even in the deepest winter. They didn't fully understand the science, but they understood the effect. Warm ground meant warm animals, warm storage pits, and warm sleeping areas. Some settlements even piped geothermal heat into their longhouses using hollowed logs, a technique so effective that archaeologists were shocked to find it existed centuries before similar methods appeared in other parts of Europe. Then there was clothing. Viking winter clothing was far superior to what most civilizations had. They layered wool, which stays warm even when wet, linen, which wicks moisture, and fur, which traps heat. But the real genius was in how they treated these clothes. Vikings coated their cloaks and boots with fish oil, making them almost waterproof. Snow slid off. Wind couldn't pierce them. Even the coldest nights couldn't reach their skin. A Viking child could walk through a blizzard wearing clothing so advanced it functioned like natural insulation. Food was the next key. The Vikings engineered a winter diet built for survival. Fermented fish, Preserved meats, aged cheeses, honey, dried fruits, and vats of beer stored in partially underground cellars ensured no one starved. Their bodies stayed fueled, warm, and energized even when fresh food couldn't be grown for months. Their storage methods were brilliant, placing food deep in the ground where the temperature stayed constant, covering pits with animal hides, insulating barrels with moss, and hanging meats in smokehouses that doubled as warm, safe rooms during storms. Livestock were kept alive using another piece of forgotten engineering: connected barns. Viking villages often linked animal shelters directly to longhouses using short hallways or enclosed tunnels. Animals produced body heat, warmth traveled between buildings, and the whole village functioned like one living organism sharing its warmth. Even manure became fuel. Dried and burned, it gave off steady heat without wasting precious firewood. But perhaps the greatest secret of all was psychological. Vikings respected winter. They prepared for it as a community. Woodcutting parties gathered months' worth of fuel, hunters stored enough food for entire neighborhoods, and elders taught children how to navigate storms by reading the shape of clouds and the direction of drifting snow. Fire was never allowed to die. Even the weakest ember was guarded like treasure. A Viking longhouse without a fire was unthinkable, a failure of duty itself. Warmth wasn't just survival, it was honor. And so, while other civilizations fled the cold, the Vikings forged an identity around it. Winter shaped their myths, their courage, their legends. They believed the cold made them stronger, that frost toughened the spirit, and that only those who embraced the harshest seasons earned a place in Valhalla. You can almost picture it now, a storm raging outside, wind slamming against the longhouse, snow burying the world. Yet inside, the glow of fire casts golden light across wooden walls. People sit together, telling stories, mending clothes, carving tools, and feeling the heat of the hearth against their faces while frost creeps across the world outside. And so the question remains, why did Viking villages never freeze? Because they refused to let winter defeat them. They turned nature into an ally. They mastered fire, earth, water, and wind. They built smarter, lived smarter, dressed smarter, and stayed united through months of darkness. And through it all, they passed their knowledge down for generations, creating a civilization that could thrive where others perished. But this is only the beginning of the story. When the first deep night of Arctic winter settled over the village of J with the QTRNFJRR, something remarkable always happened. Instead of panic or dread, there was a quiet shift in the atmosphere, a kind of focused calm that spread through the entire settlement. Winter was not a sudden event for the Vikings, it was a long-expected guest. Every person, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, had a role when the long dark arrived. You could feel it in the air, people moved slower, but with more purpose, conversations grew softer, fires were fed more often, and every sound outside, every gust of wind, every cracking tree branch, became a warning or a sign. Yet the village never felt cold, never felt abandoned. It felt prepared. Take the fishermen, for example. In many ancient cultures, winter ended all fishing. Rivers froze, seas became deadly, and boats stayed anchored. But not in a Viking village. The Vikings developed a winter fishing method that still amazes historians, cutting precise rectangular holes in sea ice, and using baited lines weighted with carved bone hooks. It wasn't just effective, it was genius. Beneath the surface, Arctic water stayed warmer than the air above, meaning fish remained active even when the world froze. And the fishermen wore layers of oil-treated wool and sealskin boots that stayed warm better than modern waterproof materials. When they returned to the village dragging nets glistening with frost, the entire settlement lit up, because fresh fish meant fresh warmth and energy. Even in the coldest months, they pulled food from beneath the ice like it was a secret treasure. Inside the longhouses, life shifted into a rhythm of survival mixed with community. At the center of every home was the hearth, its glow touching the faces of every person inside. Fire wasn't simply heat. It was identity. A Viking longhouse was designed to channel warmth like a living organism, Raised benches along the walls doubled as heated sleeping areas, with thick layers of wool and animal hides trapping the warmth beneath. Families slept shoulder to shoulder, not because they lacked space, but because body heat was better preserved together. Sleeping separately in winter was considered wasteful, even foolish. Together, people stayed warmer, bonded stronger, and shared the kinds of stories that carried them through months of darkness. And those stories mattered. In winter, storytelling became a survival skill. Elders recited sagas of warriors battling ice giants, of explorers crossing frozen seas, of gods who controlled fire and frost. These stories weren't just entertainment, they taught lessons hidden inside myth. Lessons about bravery, caution, preparation, and respect for nature. Children grew up hearing that fire was a gift from the gods and that winter was a test. A Viking child learned that fear didn't keep you alive, knowledge did. Understanding the wind, reading snow patterns, knowing the sound of cracking ice, recognizing when a storm was coming, these skills were passed down through stories long before they were learned through experience. Perhaps the most fascinating winter technique the Vikings mastered was wind blocking. Modern architects talk endlessly about wind resistance, but the Vikings solved the issue elegantly centuries earlier. They positioned their villages near natural windbreaks, rocky cliffs, dense forests, hills shaped by centuries of glacier movement. And where nature did not provide protection, they created it. Wattle fences filled with branches and moss absorbed the force of winter winds, redirecting them harmlessly around the longhouses. This reduced heat loss dramatically. Even the placement of their homes, clustered close together, was intentional. The houses formed a thermal barrier against the storm, with outer homes shielding inner homes. This formation created pockets of warm air that circulated between buildings. A Viking village wasn't just a group of houses, it was a heat-retaining ecosystem. Another forgotten innovation was their smoke. Most ancient homes used fire, but Viking fire produced smoke that helped insulate the interior. The upper layers of the longhouse filled with a thin layer of warm smoke, trapped by the sloped roof. This smoke layer acted like a heated ceiling, radiating warmth downward. And because the smoke hole was small and positioned strategically, the dangerous fumes escaped slowly enough to keep fresh air circulating without letting the heat escape. Archaeologists believe this was a deliberate design, not an accident. The Vikings had found a way to make even smoke work for them, turning every part of their home into a tool for survival. But the greatest secret of Viking winter survival might have been their cooperation. Unlike many ancient societies where wealth determined who survived harsh seasons, Viking villages treated winter as a collective challenge. If one family had more dried fish than they needed, they shared it. If someone's roof was damaged by snow, the entire neighborhood gathered to repair it. If a hunter returned with a large kill, the meat was divided among households, prioritized first for families with children or elders. This wasn't charity, it was strategy. A village where everyone had enough was a village that stayed alive. A village with weak links was a village destined to freeze. There was also a psychological advantage in Viking culture, one outsiders rarely understand. To them, suffering wasn't a punishment. It was a story, a test, a path to becoming legendary. Winter wasn't a threat, it was a chance to prove yourself worthy of the gods. When people see hardship as part of their identity, fear loses its power. A Viking waking up to a wall of snow didn't curse the sky. He smirked, tightened the knot on his wool cloak, and stepped into the storm like he was greeting an old friend. And so life continued. Children carved toys from discarded wood scraps. Women spun wool and prepared thick cloaks for the next generation. Men sharpened tools and repaired sleds. Outside, snow piled higher than doors, but inside, laughter echoed through longhouses lit by firelight. The warmth wasn't just from flames. It came from people living, breathing, working, and surviving together. The further north you go, the more magical the winter becomes, and Viking settlements were often built where the northern lights danced across the sky like rippling curtains of green fire. Imagine sitting inside a warm longhouse while the world outside glows with shimmering lights. To the Vikings, these lights weren't just beauty. They were protection, signs from the gods, reminders that even the darkest nights held wonders. When storms raged, they looked to the sky and believed it watched over them. And so, villages like J with the cute RNFJRR never froze. Not because the world outside wasn't deadly, but because the people inside refused to let death take root. They crafted a life that matched the cold blow for blow, turning weakness into strength, fear into wisdom, and winter into something almost sacred. And the story goes deeper still. As the Arctic winter tightened its grip around J with the QTRNFJRR, something even more extraordinary unfolded beneath the snow, an unseen network of survival that outsiders rarely witnessed. Beneath the thick layers of frost, under floors warmed by packed earth and glowing embers, ran a system of hidden passageways and storage chambers that acted as the village's second heartbeat. These underground spaces were carved generations earlier using tools of bone, antler, and iron, slowly expanded through centuries of harsh seasons. While the world above froze solid, the earth below held steady, a dependable constant where food, tools, and sometimes even people found refuge. These chambers weren't random pits. They were engineered with a precision modern archaeologists still struggle to replicate. The entrances were small and cleverly disguised under benches or behind hanging firs, allowing warm indoor air to sink downward. The Vikings understood a principle that many ancient civilizations overlooked: cold rises, heat falls. By funneling warm air downward, they created underground pockets that stayed above freezing even during the cruelest nights. Here they stored butter wrapped in birch bark, pots of fermented vegetables, sacks of barley, bundles of dried herbs, and small barrels of honey mead. Everything had a place. Everything had a purpose. Nothing was wasted. During the darkest nights, when blizzards howled so fiercely that even the walls of the longhouses trembled, families would descend into these chambers, not out of fear, but out of tradition. The underground rooms became story spaces, quiet sanctuaries where elders passed down knowledge too sacred to speak loudly. Secrets of reading the wind. The best months to cure fish. The meaning of certain cloud shapes. How to survive the whiteouts that could swallow a traveler whole. Knowledge was their real shield against winter, forged not of iron but of memory. Above ground, the snow wasn't an obstacle, it was an ally. As it piled higher, it pressed against the walls of the longhouses, sealing them tighter and making them even warmer. The Vikings understood snow the way sailors understood the sea. They read its texture, its weight, its silence. They could tell when ice was forming beneath the snow, when drifts would shift and collapse, when a storm was gathering beyond the horizon. Their relationship with winter wasn't just survival, it was mastery. Inside the homes, time flowed differently. Days were measured not by the sun but by the rhythm of chores, tending the fire, boiling broth, carving tools, patching boots, repairing fishing nets. Women spun thick wool using spindle whorls decorated with symbols meant to bless the home. Men shaped iron in small forges fueled by dried peat and driftwood collected during summer. Children played with carved figures of gods and animals, their laughter bouncing off walls darkened by centuries of smoke. Even the smallest moments felt warmer against the backdrop of the storm outside. And yet, the most magical part of Viking winter happened when the storm finally broke. The sky would clear, revealing a dome of stars as sharp as glass and air so cold it sparkled. On nights like these, entire families stepped outside, wrapped in layers of wool and fur, to witness the aurora borealis. The northern lights cascaded across the heavens in waves of green, violet, and pale blue, dancing silently as if performing for the tiny human settlement huddled beneath them. To the Vikings, this was no ordinary light. It was the armor of the gods, a celestial shield stretching across the sky. Children believed they could hear the lights singing if they listened hard enough. Elders claimed the lights carried messages, warnings, blessings, perhaps even glimpses of the afterlife. But the sky wasn't always peaceful. Winter brought threats beyond storms. wolves starving after long months of scarce prey, bears driven from their dens, and the haunting quiet of the tundra where sound could carry for miles. Yet even these dangers didn't break Viking resolve. They built perimeter markers of sharpened stakes frozen solid into the ground. They trained dogs, massive, powerful Nordic breeds, to patrol the edges of the village. And they kept their weapons close, axes hung near doorways, spears leaned against walls, knives tucked beneath bedding. Not because they lived in constant fear, but because they believed preparedness was honor. A Viking who allowed danger to surprise his family was considered irresponsible, almost shameful. Every winter night held rituals, small acts woven into life that gave meaning to the cold. A bowl of broth left outside the door for wandering spirits. A log placed in the fire with a whispered prayer for the ancestors. A lullaby sung softly to children, promising warmth, light, and the return of spring. These rituals weren't superstition, they were psychological armor. They gave the people strength where the world offered only darkness. And the remarkable thing? Even outsiders, traders, travelers, refugees, who braved the journey to a Viking settlement in winter were welcomed with warmth that defied logic. Hospitality was sacred. A freezing stranger wasn't a burden, he was a test of character. Fires burned a little higher. Bowls of stew were filled a little deeper. Wolves could claw at the outer walls, but inside, humanity glowed brighter than the flames. To survive winter was to survive together. One of the least understood Viking winter secrets involved their boats. Even when seas froze solid, Vikings didn't abandon their ships. They pulled them onto land, propped them up on rock supports, and wrapped the hulls in layers of straw and turf. This kept the wood from cracking in the cold and created makeshift shelters for tools and supplies. A Viking never let his boat die, even in winter, because a boat wasn't just a vessel, it was freedom. It meant trade, exploration, escape, opportunity. Even when the ocean slept under a blanket of ice, the Vikings prepared for the day it would awaken. But the most astonishing truth behind their winter resilience lay not in their tools or techniques, but in their worldview. Vikings didn't see nature as something to defeat. They saw themselves as part of it. They believed the cold shaped their spirit the way rivers shape stone. They believed fire was a gift, not a guarantee. They lived knowing life was fragile, and that fragility made it precious. Winter wasn't a punishment, it was a reminder that strength comes from understanding your limits and pushing against them anyway. So the question remains, why did Viking villages never freeze? Because they refused to face winter alone. They prepared with the earth, with fire, with engineering, with culture, with belief. They didn't wait for warmth, they created it. They didn't hope for spring, they earned it. And yet, the story stretches even deeper. As winter tightened even further around Jay with the Qtarnfjrr, the landscape transformed into something almost otherworldly. The fjords froze in thick bands of blue ice, the forests fell silent, and the sky remained dim for days at a time. Yet, through the heart of this icy world, thin trails of rising smoke wound upward from Viking longhouses like veins of warmth pushing back against the cold. And deep within each of those longhouses, life pulsed with determination. One of the most underrated aspects of Viking winter survival was their mastery over light. Most ancient cultures relied on simple torches that burned quickly in smoke-filled rooms. But the Vikings crafted lamps made from hollowed-out stones, filled with animal fat and a twisted moss wick. These lamps burned slowly, evenly, almost silently. Their glow was soft but long-lasting, casting warm golden halos that made the wooden walls shimmer like amber. On the darkest nights, when the sky outside seemed to press down on earth itself, these lamps kept spirits from sinking into despair. Children watched the flickering light dance on the rafters as their parents whispered tales of gods forging stars out of frozen sparks. Light wasn't just illumination. It was hope. It was warmth of the mind. Another secret lay in the way they slept. While many civilizations slept on cold floors or thin mats, Vikings built raised wooden platforms packed with straw, furs, and wool blankets so thick they resembled soft animal dens. These sleeping areas were communal, with entire families resting close enough to share breath. The combination of insulation beneath, furs above, and bodies generating heat together created pockets of warmth that felt almost tropical compared to the bitter world outside. Even when temperatures outside plummeted to life-threatening levels, inside these warm nests, children slept soundly, hearing only the low hum of the hearth fire and the muffled roar of the storm beyond the walls. But not every winter night was peaceful. There were moments when storms struck with such ferocity that even seasoned warriors felt a tremor of unease. When the wind screamed like a living creature and the snow fell so hard it erased the horizon, the Vikings relied on a communal survival tactic they called storm sharing. No one stayed alone. Neighboring families gathered inside one longhouse, the one with the best roof, the strongest walls, or the largest hearth. Dozens of people might huddle together, filling every corner with warmth, breath, sound, and life. Imagine a room full of families sitting shoulder to shoulder, sharing food, blankets, and stories while outside the world vanished in a white blur. Storm sharing didn't just save energy or keep people warm. It built unity, trust, and an unbreakable sense of belonging. While younger men patrolled the village during these storms, checking for structural damage or hungry animals lurking in the shadows, the elders remained inside, becoming the guardians of tradition. They presided over a sacred practice known as hearth keeping. The hearth fire was fed slowly, deliberately, with carefully chosen wood types: pine for quick heat, birch for steady warmth, and slow-burning driftwood collected from distant coasts for long nights. Letting the hearth die was considered a sign of negligence, even dishonor. A Viking home without fire was like a body without a soul. And so, with quiet reverence, elders kept the flames alive through the longest nights of the year. The relationship between Vikings and their animals during winter was equally remarkable. Cows, goats, sheep, and horses were not merely food or labor, they were vital partners in survival. The barns, connected directly to the longhouses, acted as additional heat sources. The animals' breath, body heat, and movements warmed the shared air. In return, the Vikings ensured their livestock were treated with surprising care. Bedding was changed frequently, water was kept unfrozen using heated stones, and sick animals were tended with herbs. Children often slept curled against the warm flanks of a goat or dog during the coldest nights. It wasn't strange. It was survival. It was family. But perhaps the most fascinating winter practice was something that visitors often found eerie at first: silent listening. Vikings believed that the world changed during winter nights. The darkness wasn't empty, it was alive. The forests creaked. Ice shifted. Snow sighed under its own weight. These sounds, subtle and ghost-like, carried meaning. Hunters could identify a distant wolf pack by the pattern of its calls echoing off frozen cliffs. Women could predict a storm by the way smoke drifted inside the longhouse. Men could sense when the sea ice was thinning by a deep rumble that vibrated through the ground long before cracks appeared. Silent listening wasn't superstition, it was survival. It was intuition honed across generations until it became almost instinctive. On certain nights, when the northern lights blazed brighter than usual, stacking colors across the sky like waterfalls of emerald and violet, the entire village stepped outside despite the cold. Wrapped in wool cloaks, they stood in silence and watched the sky ripple and twist as if stirred by a celestial hand. These gatherings weren't ritualistic, they were communal awe. A reminder that even in a world frozen stiff, magic still flowed above their heads. Children whispered that the lights were the shields of Valkyries riding across the heavens. Adults whispered that the lights were a sign their ancestors watched over them, guiding them through the cold season. Even the toughest warriors felt a sense of humility under that sky. Yet winter, despite all its beauty, remained unpredictable. And one year, that unpredictability struck with brutal force. A storm unlike anything J with the QTAR had seen in decades descended without warning. Winds tore at rooftops. Ice shards flew like knives. Snow buried entire walkways within minutes. The sky vanished in a swirling gray vortex so thick even torchlight dissolved in it. People rushed inside longhouses, dragging children, tools, and animals behind them. Doors were barricaded. Fires were fed. Families gathered close, listening as the storm roared outside like an ancient beast awakened from its slumber. Hours passed. Then a day. Then another. And yet, inside the longhouses, the warmth held. Viking architecture, community, and preparation all functioned exactly as designed. The turf walls stayed intact. The rafters held firm. The hearths burned bright. The people remained calm, focused, resilient. They ate from their underground stores. They shared warmth, laughter, stories. The storm tested them, pushed them, but did not break them. This was the essence of Viking survival. They didn't beat winter by being stronger. They beat winter by being smarter. By working with it, not against it. By shaping culture, technology, and community around the simple truth: cold is only deadly if you face it alone. And somewhere in that storm, in the heart of that deadly silence, the Vikings proved once again why their villages never froze. When the storm finally loosened its grip on Jay with the QTRNFJRR, the world outside had transformed into a white labyrinth. Doors were blocked by snow drifts taller than a man. The familiar paths between longhouses had vanished under smooth, glistening mounds. Trees bent low under the weight of ice, frozen into strange, crystalline shapes that resembled ancient guardians standing sentinel at the edge of the village. Yet even in this altered landscape, the Vikings did not hesitate. They had weathered the worst of nature's fury, and now it was time to reclaim their world. The first people to emerge were the young scouts, boys and girls no older than 14, bundled in layers of wool and fur. They pushed open the heavy doors with long poles, carving narrow tunnels through the packed snow. Their cheeks stung from the cold, but their eyes were sharp, alert. They were trained for this. Winter scouting was a rite of passage, a test of courage that taught them to read the terrain and protect the community. The scouts leapt onto the snow like foxes, light-footed and fearless, poking the ground to find hollow spots or hidden ice. Soon after, the adults followed, armed with shovels, carved wooden boards, and long-handled axes. Clearing snow wasn't just labor, it was a strategy. The pathways they carved were deliberately shaped to channel wind, redirect drifts, and keep future snowfall from trapping families inside. They did it with practiced ease, as though sculpting the village out of winter itself. Even more impressive was how the Vikings treated the aftermath of a storm as an opportunity rather than a setback. The massive snowbanks that buried half the settlement became raw material for construction. Children began building snow walls that served as temporary windbreaks. Hunters carved out tunnels to use as cold storage corridors, keeping meat frozen but protected from animals. Some families even constructed snow shelters shaped like half-domes, warmer than tents and stronger than wood against fierce winds. Winter had taken its shot. The village took the ice and turned it into armor. But the most intimate moments of winter recovery unfolded inside the longhouses. When people returned indoors after hours of digging and scouting, the first thing they noticed wasn't the heat, it was the smell. Warm stews simmering in clay pots, rich with dried fish, onions, and herbs stored since autumn. Fresh bread baked on flat stones placed near the fire. Hanging strips of smoked meat releasing scents that reminded everyone of better seasons. Those meals were more than food, they were a celebration of endurance. A message shared silently between every person: we survived again. One of the most beautiful Viking traditions happened on the evening after a great storm. Families gathered around the hearth to perform what they called winter counting. It wasn't a formal ceremony, it was a gentle, reflective moment where they reviewed everything and everyone the storm touched. They counted repaired roofs, mended tools, patched cloaks, safe animals, returned hunters. It was their way of acknowledging that winter had challenged them, but not defeated them. And if something had been lost, a small item, a tool, even a goat, they shared stories about it, laughed, mourned a little, and then moved on together. Winter only held power over those who let grief linger. Yet the cold did not care for human ritual. It continued pressing its weight onto the village. Nights were long and black. The air outside was the kind of stillness that made a person hold their breath. But inside the longhouses, warmth multiplied. Not only from the fire, but from constant activity. In one corner, two brothers braided rope from horsehair, their hands moving automatically even as they teased each other. Near the hearth, a grandmother carved runes into a smooth piece of driftwood, whispering blessings with every stroke. Children gathered around her, watching the symbols appear as if they held secrets only elders understood. This was how Viking knowledge survived, through small moments repeated thousands of times. And the knowledge was vast. For instance, Vikings understood how snow behaved under different temperatures. Hard, squeaky snow meant extreme cold but good conditions for travel. Wet, heavy snow meant danger, roofs could collapse under its weight. They listened for the faint groan of timber under strain, the subtle shift of beams as they swelled and shrank in the freeze. If a sound felt wrong, a whole team of men would climb onto the roof with shovels, sweeping snow away in a rhythmic, almost ceremonial dance. But even with all their preparation, the Vikings were not immune to fear. One night, a sound echoed through the village, a deep, resonant cracking that rolled like thunder across the frozen ground. People stiffened. Children fell silent. Dogs stood with ears raised, growling softly. They all knew what that sound meant: ice shifting in the fjord. If the fjord ice cracked too much, it could end winter fishing for weeks. Worse, it could trap or kill anyone caught near the shoreline. So a group of seasoned fishermen and hunters, wrapped head to toe, ventured toward the fjord carrying long spears and lanterns shielded with glass. Their breath formed clouds in the frozen air. As they approached, the ground trembled again. The fjord's surface, once solid and blue, now bore jagged lines of black that stretched like veins across its body. The men knelt, placing their palms on the ice. They listened, not with their ears, but with their bones. They felt the patterns of the vibrations, the rhythm of the cracks, the pulse of the water beneath. Then, almost unanimously, they nodded. The ice would hold. It was shifting, yes, but stabilizing. They marked the weak spots with carved wooden stakes so no one accidentally stepped on them. Then they returned home to the longhouses, greeted by relieved faces and warm hands pulling them inside. This was Viking winter wisdom. Danger never vanished, but knowledge always softened its edges. As nights passed, the villagers continued strengthening the bonds that kept them alive. Storytelling reached a peak during the deepest cold. Warriors recited sagas of great battles, describing frost-coated shields and midnight raids lit only by moonlight. Women told tales of mythical creatures that lived in frozen caves, spirits who protected children or punished thieves. Elders spoke of ancient winters when the sky stayed black for weeks, and yet the people still endured. Stories weren't escape, they were memory. They were blueprints for survival. And the winter was far from over. The cold would deepen. The winds would rise. More storms would come. Yet even as the village braced for what lay ahead, one truth echoed in every corner of J with a Qtar and FJRR. A Viking village never froze because its people never faced the cold alone. Their survival was a tapestry woven from countless threads: knowledge, unity, architecture, rituals, courage, and above all, unbreakable community. And winter, no matter how fierce, could not unravel it. Their voices carried through the icy air as if the cold itself stepped aside to let the sound pass. It was in these nightly circles that the true magic of Viking warmth emerged: the unity of a village, the shared responsibility, the emotional heat that no winter could extinguish. Elders would retell the same ancient tales, stories of ancestors who crossed seas of ice, who challenged storms so brutal that even the gods hid behind mountains. And as these stories echoed in the hall, something remarkable happened: fear melted. The cold lost its bite. Children drifted to sleep against the warm bodies of their parents, and warriors polished their blades by the firelight, preparing for tomorrow, not with dread but with purpose. Outside, the wind clawed at the wooden walls, but Viking houses didn't fear the wind. They were designed to ignore it. The thick earth walls absorbed the shock, the sod roofs held tight, and the entire house acted like a living creature, breathing just enough to remove smoke but never enough to let heat escape. Even the location of the village itself was chosen with precision. Vikings never built homes exposed on open plains. They found natural shields, hills, cliffs, forests, that blocked northern winds. Some villages were nestled between mountains. Others sat by fjords whose calm waters reflected sunlight back onto homes during winter's limited daylight. But the biggest mystery was this: how did they generate so much heat in a world where wood was scarce and winters lasted half the year? The answer lay in a clever system that archaeologists still marvel at today. Beneath many Viking houses, layers of stone and clay were arranged in a way that trapped geothermal heat rising from the ground. These stones warmed slowly during the day, nearly invisible to the touch, but once night came, they radiated a gentle, steady warmth under the floor. No fire required. No fuel burned. Just the earth itself acting as a silent heater. And while the world slept under blankets of snow, Viking villages created their own tiny summers indoors. The combination of body heat, trapped fire warmth, geothermal floors, animal insulation, and airtight architecture meant that even on nights where temperatures outside dropped so low that breath froze midair, Viking children slept barefoot, wrapped in soft furs, dreaming peacefully. It wasn't just engineering, it was survival shaped by centuries of understanding the land. Every morning, the village awoke in a routine that kept the warmth alive. Fires were never allowed to fully die, someone always tended them. Women stirred thick porridge in iron cauldrons, steam filling the room like fog. Warriors stepped outside to test the air, their eyelashes beaded with frost within seconds. Animals stomped in the attached barns, their warmth drifting in through shared walls. Snow piled high, but no one rushed to clear it from the roof. Snow acted as extra insulation, like nature's own blanket sealing in heat. And then there was clothing. Viking garments were not random furs thrown together. They were engineered. Inner layers of soft wool trapped heat, middle layers of woven fabric created pockets of warm air, and outer layers of tightly cured leather or fur blocked moisture and wind. This natural, triple-layer insulation worked so well that even when temperatures plunged below what modern people consider survivable, Vikings walked miles through snow without freezing. Their secret wasn't that they didn't feel cold, they simply understood it, and used every tool nature provided to outsmart it. As the darkest days of winter passed, those endless Arctic nights where the sun barely peeked over the horizon, the village stayed alive through ritual and rhythm. Children helped spread straw across the floor to increase insulation. Men sealed wall gaps with moss mixed with fish oil, creating a flexible, waterproof sealant that never hardened in the cold. Women spun wool tighter than any modern machine could replicate. Everything served a purpose. And through all of this, a question lingered: how did Viking villages remain so consistently warm while other civilizations at similar latitudes struggled? The deeper answer reveals something profound. Vikings didn't fight winter. They partnered with it. Instead of building tall structures that lost heat, they built low, earth-hugging homes. Instead of relying on fire alone, they created systems, geothermal floors, insulated roofs, shared barns, that multiplied every bit of warmth. Instead of isolating families, they gathered in halls to share collective heat. Instead of fearing snow, they used it. Even the placement of their villages near the ocean wasn't an accident. Sea air, especially in fjords, was often slightly warmer than air over frozen land. Winds sweeping in from the water carried just enough warmth to prevent the worst chills from settling. This natural climate advantage, paired with their architecture, created a micro-environment where freezing simply didn't win. Night after night, families lay close together, their breaths mingling in the warm, dim glow of the hearth. Outside, wolves howled across frozen valleys. Wind screamed against mountains. Snowfall buried the world in silence. But inside Viking villages, fire cracked, wood smoked softly, children giggled under fur blankets, and the ancient heartbeat of survival pulsed through every wall, every beam, every glowing ember. That is why Viking villages never froze. They were not just shelters. They were living ecosystems, built with intelligence, maintained with discipline, and perfected over generations. Long before modern insulation, central heating, or engineered materials, the Vikings crafted warmth out of earth, air, fire, community, and knowledge passed down like sacred treasure. And even now, centuries later, when archaeologists step into the remains of those ancient homes, the earth still holds a whisper of heat, as if the warmth never truly left. Because warmth, to the Vikings, wasn't just temperature, it was survival woven into culture. On the coldest nights, when the aurora painted the sky in shimmering green waves, families gathered around the central hearth not simply for heat but for connection. The hearth was the heart of the home. Its flames were tended with near-spiritual devotion. Each spark symbolized life pushing back against the vast, frozen world outside. But the warmth inside Viking villages wasn't only physical, it was psychological. Stories were warmth. Laughter was warmth. Music from bone flutes and simple string instruments wrapped the mind in comfort. Even during snowstorms so fierce they erased the horizon, Viking halls echoed with singing. These songs were more than entertainment. They regulated breathing, reduced stress, and held the community together in calm unity. Modern scientists know that shared rhythmic singing raises body temperature slightly. The Vikings didn't know the science, but they knew the effect. Even their meals fought the cold. Viking stews simmered for hours, thick with barley, root vegetables, dried fish, or preserved meat. The heat from the pot warmed the center of the room, and the calories provided slow-burning fuel the body needed to stay warm throughout the night. Fermented drinks added warmth that lingered long after the fire dimmed. And after eating, Vikings wrapped themselves in layered sleeping arrangements, furs on the bottom, wool blankets on top, creating a pocket of heat that was nearly impossible to penetrate from outside. But the brilliance of the Viking winter strategy didn't end indoors. Step outside a Viking village during winter, and you would notice something strange. There were no long shadows cast by tall buildings. Viking houses were built low and wide, so winter winds rolled over them rather than slamming into them. The roofs were angled just enough to shed rain but flat enough to hold thick layers of insulating snow. Because of this design, even strong Arctic gusts that could knock travelers off horses simply slid past Viking homes like harmless whispers. The village layout followed similar principles. Homes were clustered tightly, reducing exposure and creating small pockets of trapped air between buildings. Narrow walkways blocked wind, turning the entire settlement into a maze that disrupted airflow. Every structure supported another. No house stood alone against winter. And if one fire went out, neighboring homes shared coal or embers, ensuring heat never died. Even their longhouses, enormous structures capable of sheltering dozens of people and animals, were masterpieces of heat retention. Wooden beams bent slightly inward, creating a natural channel for smoke to rise without letting precious warm air escape. The walls were triple layered with timber, mud, and woven branches. Over time, these walls compressed tighter, becoming even better insulators. And when families and livestock gathered under one roof, the temperature inside could climb so high that snow on the roof melted, only to freeze again on the outer layer, forming an even stronger shield. But behind all this engineering genius was one fundamental truth. Vikings adapted to winter by understanding it deeply. They watched how animals survived. Bears slept close to the ground in insulated dens. Foxes curled into balls to reduce heat loss. Birds huddled together for warmth. The Vikings mirrored these strategies in design and daily life. Their homes were dens. Their sleeping arrangements were huddles. Their communal gatherings were survival instincts turned into culture. At night, when the moon cast long silver beams across frozen fjords, watchmen patrolled the village edges. Not to guard against humans, but against the cold. Their job was to ensure fires stayed alive, walls remained sealed, and no weak spot allowed winter to creep in. If wind found a crack, the watchmen stuffed it with moss. If the fire burned low, they fed it with peat. If snow piled too high, they redistributed it to balance insulation. This constant maintenance meant the village was not a static place but a living, breathing shield against the Arctic. Inside, children slept next to dogs, not as pets, but as ancient partners in warmth. Viking dogs were large, thick-furred, bred for endurance. Their heat helped keep children warm, while the children's presence kept the animals calm and still. This symbiotic sleep arrangement is one reason Viking infants had higher winter survival rates than many other ancient cultures. Even the sense of the Viking home contributed to warmth. Resin from pine torches, oils from preserved food, smoke from the hearth, all of it clung to the walls, creating a subtle layer that trapped humidity and reduced heat loss. Combined with the moisture from cooking and breathing, Viking homes maintained a stable indoor climate that modern scientists would classify as quasi-humid warm microenvironments. And this is where the real secret lies. Vikings didn't create heat. They captured it. Every breath, every ember, every body, every animal, every stone, all combined to form a web of warmth that winter couldn't break. The cold could roar outside, but inside, life carried on as if seasons didn't matter. Meanwhile, the outside environment played its role. Coastal Viking settlements benefited from the North Atlantic Drift, a warm ocean current that moderated temperatures. While inland regions froze solid, fjordside villages remained a few degrees warmer, often enough to make the difference between life and death. The Vikings learned to build near these water-warm zones, using geography itself as a shield. Still, storms came. Storms that turned entire landscapes white, storms that swallowed sound and erased direction. During those storms, families gathered in the main hall for safety. People lay shoulder to shoulder in a great sea of furs, breathing warmth into a confined space until the room glowed with human heat. Children listened to tales of gods battling frost giants, and the walls of the hall seemed to vibrate with each heroic name spoken. And in these moments, the truth became clear. Viking warmth was not only about architecture or clothing or clever engineering. It was about community. Alone, a Viking could freeze. Together, they became a furnace. Their greatest weapon against winter was each other. Because when the wind howled loud enough to make the earth tremble, the Vikings answered with unity. The longhouse doors stayed barred, the hearth glowed like a captured sun, and the entire village breathed in one shared rhythm. Winter might rage outside, but inside, the air pulsed with life, strength, and stubborn warmth. And this unity was woven into their everyday routines designed to keep freezing at bay even when the world turned white. Every dawn, long before the first hint of sunlight touched the horizon, a quiet ritual began. The designated firekeeper, usually an elder or a trusted family member, woke before everyone else. Their hands moved through the darkness, feeling for the glowing heart of last night's fire buried under ashes. With a few careful breaths and slivers of dry wood, the embers sparked back to life. This ritual wasn't optional, it was survival. A fire that died overnight meant walls stiffened with cold, breath misting in the air, and animals growing restless. In the Viking world, the line between warmth and danger was thin, but discipline kept them on the right side of it. As morning light slowly filtered in, cold, pale, and fragile, the activities of the village began. Children gathered snow that had drifted against the outer walls and piled it on the roofs. This wasn't play, it was insulation. Thick snow acted as a perfect natural blanket, trapping heat inside the home. Other children foraged for firewood, though it was used sparingly, replaced often by peat bricks or dried seaweed that burned slow and steady. Every resource was precious in winter. Women stirred enormous pots of soup, their breath mingling with the steam rising from the cauldron. The warmth from the fire, the heat from the cooking pot, and the moisture it released into the air were part of a delicate ecosystem that kept the home from drying and cracking in the cold. If the air became too dry, the walls shrank. If it became too humid, mold crept in. But Vikings managed it all instinctively, balancing temperature and moisture as if they had been engineers long before engineering existed. Outside, men chipped away ice from the animal troughs and checked the barn walls for gaps. Animals were more than livestock, they were shared heaters. Cows, goats, and sheep produced enormous warmth, and keeping them comfortable meant keeping the house warm too. In harsh winters, animals and humans sometimes slept only a wall apart, separated by wooden beams but united by the shared struggle to stay alive. The warmth that radiated through those beams was subtle but constant, enough to raise indoor temperatures by several degrees. Even the infamous Viking raids paused during the deepest cold. Winter wasn't a season for conquest, it was a season for preservation, preparation, and rebuilding. Instead of sailing icy waters, Vikings repaired ships indoors, using tar warmed by the hearth to seal wood. They sharpened weapons, mended clothing, and carved new tools. Every task created friction, heat, and movement, all contributing to the delicate balance of keeping the longhouse warm. And while the world outside lay frozen under layers of ice, inside the hall, the air shimmered with the golden glow of torchlight. Smoke rose slowly upward, creating dark patterns on the rafters as it escaped through carefully crafted vents. Vikings understood airflow like few ancient cultures. They designed their homes so warm air stayed low where people sat and slept, while cold air drifted toward the edges or escaped upward. Even without chimneys in the modern sense, their smoke vents acted as primitive thermostats. And during the long nights where darkness stretched endlessly, swallowing entire days, storytelling became more than entertainment. It became a psychological defense against the cold. A good story could make the air feel warmer, the fire burn brighter, and the night seem shorter. Tales of frost giants, sea serpents, and gods who tamed storms carried a moral. Winter might be powerful, but humans were clever. Sometimes, elders described the very first winters after their ancestors reached Scandinavia, winters so cold that lakes froze deep enough to swallow entire forests, and lock them beneath glassy surfaces. Those early settlers learned quickly: build deeper, build lower, build warmer. Over generations, Viking homes evolved into expertly insulated structures, shaped by trial and error, victory and failure, warmth and cold. But even with perfect homes, perfect clothing, and perfect systems, the Vikings relied on something else, something invisible but stronger than any structure: shared heat. When bodies gathered close, when families slept in clusters, when the village pressed together in the hall, they created a microclimate that winter couldn't break. A Viking alone could freeze, but a Viking among others became nearly untouchable. Outside, storms raged. Snow drifted high enough to cover windows. Ice hung from roofs and dagger-like spears. Wolves prowled near the edges of the village, their breath visible in the moonlight. The world was dangerous, wild, and indifferent. But inside, the longhouse glowed. It glowed with fire. It glowed with breath. It glowed with courage. It glowed with people refusing to surrender to the cold. And that glow, that stubborn flame of life, is the reason Viking villages never froze. Not because winter wasn't harsh. Not because they had magic. But because they understood something many civilizations still fail to grasp. Warmth is not just heat. Warmth is design, discipline, community, and the willingness to endure together. Because even as the storms deepened and the nights stretched longer than anyone could count, the Vikings knew that winter was never truly the enemy. It was a test, a constant, relentless test, and every decision they made, every structure they built, every ritual they followed was a quiet, stubborn answer to that test. The cold sought to seep into every crack, every breath, every bone. But the Vikings sealed, warmed, and reinforced everything until winter had no path inside. In many villages, the sound of winter was almost comforting. The groan of wooden beams expanding and contracting, the soft thud of snow sliding off a roof, the flapping hides over doorways slapping against the wind, these noises were signs that the system was working. If the house groaned, it meant the structure was alive. If snow slid, it meant the insulation held. If the wind couldn't push past the hanging hides, it meant warmth stayed trapped. Inside, families moved with purpose. No one wasted energy. No unnecessary movements, no idle tasks. Even the smallest child had a job, twisting wool, carrying straw, wiping condensation from the wooden beams so mold wouldn't form. Everything inside the longhouse had a rhythm, timed perfectly with the needs of the cold season. Vikings didn't wait for winter to attack. They anticipated every blow, every freeze, every shift in temperature. The nights were the most enchanting. When darkness swallowed everything beyond the village, tiny flickers of flame danced on the walls, turning shadows into ancient shapes. Children whispered that the shadows were protectors, guardians made from the memories of ancestors who had survived winters even worse than the present ones. The elders didn't deny it. In a way, it was true. Every log on the fire, every wool blanket, every beam had been shaped by generations who knew how to tame the cold. As people drifted to sleep, the longhouse transformed into something magical. Breath hung in the air, glowing faintly in firelight. Dogs curled into the crooks of elbows and knees. Babies slept in fur-lined wooden cradles hung from the rafters, swaying gently as the house shifted with the wind. The fire burned low, embers glowing like newborn stars. And through all of it, the house radiated heat not just from flames, but from bodies. Late in the night, a lone caretaker walked the hall, adding bits of wood to the fire, adjusting blankets, checking the walls for drafts. Their footsteps were soft, barely disturbing the heavy calm. This caretaker, often someone too old for hunting but too proud to rest, played a silent role that everyone depended on. Their steady watch kept the cold from creeping in while others slept. And while the village slept, the world outside kept changing. Snow piled higher. Ice grew thicker. Lakes froze so solid that they reflected the sky like perfect mirrors. The aurora rippled silently, casting green and pink waves across the frozen land. Winter was vast, powerful, and beautiful in its danger. But the Vikings knew how to bend that danger. They built food stores underground where the earth stayed cold enough to preserve food but not cold enough to freeze it solid. They layered furs over the entrances of these storehouses so that the heat from the earth never escaped upward. They wrapped tools in leather, greased with animal fat, so metal wouldn't crack from sudden temperature changes. Everything they touched carried the echoes of survival. And when the cold reached its peak, when even the sea froze near the coastlines, the Vikings didn't panic. They adapted. They knew that the coldest nights were often followed by the clearest mornings. On those mornings, the entire village sparkled under a hard, diamond-like frost. People emerged slowly from their homes, breath steaming in clouds, boots crunching on frozen earth. The silence was profound, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Men checked their fishing nets, sometimes set beneath sheets of ice through carved holes. Women fed the animals warm mash. Children played with frozen bubbles they blew into the air, laughing as the bubbles crystallized before falling intact to the ground. Even in the harshest cold, life continued. But the secret behind Viking warmth wasn't simply construction, animals, or fire, it was their mindset. They didn't believe warmth should come from a single source. They believed it should come from everywhere. The hearth warmed the home, bodies warmed each other, animals warmed the walls, stories warmed the soul, food warmed the body, and discipline warmed the future. And above all, they believed that no one should ever face winter alone. That belief shaped the architecture of the village. Homes were always built close. No Viking house stood isolated, because isolation meant heat loss. The closer the structures, the warmer the environment between them. This layout created pockets of trapped air that acted as invisible shields. Even the narrowest alleyway had purpose, funneling wind away from entrances, creating small microzones where snow melted faster from the combined radiance of nearby walls. And if a home was damaged by storms or frost, the entire village repaired it, often within the same day. A single damaged house meant weakened insulation for all. A crack in one wall was a crack in the village. They rebuilt, reinforced, and sealed together. This collective strength was the fire they carried inside, the fire that no winter could extinguish. And so the centuries passed. Winter after winter, storm after storm. Empires far away fell to famine and cold, But Viking villages endured, thriving in a landscape that should have claimed them. Their homes, their systems, their rituals, everything they engineered became the foundation for one of the most resilient cold-weather cultures in history. And that resilience is why Viking villages did not simply survive Arctic winters. They conquered them. Because while the world beyond their wooden walls froze into silence, inside the Viking village time moved with a different rhythm, slower, warmer, anchored in human connection and ancient knowledge. Every breath inside those homes mattered. Every ember mattered. Every movement of every person, every animal, every flame worked together like gears in a great living machine built not of metal, but of instinct and memory. As winter deepened, the Vikings tapped into their greatest resource, tradition. They didn't experiment recklessly in winter. They relied on techniques refined over centuries. One such tradition was the night bedding ritual. Before sleeping, families layered the floor with fresh straw, not only to soften the ground but to trap body heat. On top of the straw came thick furs, seal, bear, reindeer, each chosen for its ability to hold warmth for hours. Children always slept in the center, surrounded by adults like living shields. Dogs curled around the outer edges, their bodies acting as warm barriers against the cold seeping through the walls. The result was a self-heating, human furnace, one of the most effective natural heating systems ever used in ancient history. Meanwhile, the fire kept its steady heartbeat. Vikings never let the flames fully die. Even if the fire dropped to nothing but faint orange flecks, those flecks held enough heat to be coaxed back into flame with skillful breath. And when the fire rose again, it wasn't just a source of heat, it was a signal of victory over the night. On the coldest evenings, the air inside the longhouse was thick with warmth, smoke, and the earthy scent of wool and wood. Adults murmured softly, sharing plans or memories. Children laughed under blankets. The crackling of burning peat mixed with the low hum of voices, creating an atmosphere so warm and intimate that even the coldest gust outside couldn't penetrate it. Outside, temperatures could plunge so low that even metal tools left outdoors grew brittle, snapping like thin wood. Frost climbed trees like ghostly fingers. Streams froze in mid-flow, forming ripples locked in time. But the Vikings had already stored everything they needed indoors. Tools hung from beams. Food rested in sealed wooden casks. Water was stored in skins, kept close to the fire so it never turned to ice. And oh, the food! Viking winter meals were designed to warm the body from the inside out. Stews thick with barley and dried meats, hot broths rich with marrow, flatbreads warmed on stones, fermented fish whose sharp smells signaled calories precious for survival. Eating wasn't merely nourishment, it was thermal fuel. The more you ate, the warmer you stayed. Every meal was cooked with purpose, to fortify everyone against the next long stretch of cold. Sometimes, during the deepest night hours, a sudden heavy thud echoed across the roof, snow sliding, ice shifting, or sometimes the weight of a passing animal. Children stirred eyes wide, but adults reassured them. The snow protects us. And it did. A thick layer of snow acted like a huge natural blanket, muting the roar of wind and sealing in warmth. Other cultures cleared snow from roofs. Vikings welcomed it. And then there were the walls, masterpieces of survival. Timber frames layered with wattle and daub, stuffed with dried moss, sealed with mud mixed with animal fat. These walls didn't just stand against winter, they collaborated with it. Moss expanded slightly in the cold, filling gaps tighter. Fat-infused mud repelled moisture, keeping the walls dry and insulated. And as smoke from the hearth drifted upward, it coated beams with a thin layer of soot that strengthened them further, nature's version of weatherproofing. The Vikings weren't simply building for shelter. They were building for eternity. Even in the spaces between houses, warmth lingered. Villages were designed so heat radiating from one home subtly warmed the walls of the next. Pathways were kept narrow, trapping warmer air and blocking the wind. Fire pits in communal areas burned day and night, heating tools, warming hands, drying clothes, and creating small bubbles of survivable air in the vast white wilderness. But the greatest secret weapon of Viking winter wasn't architecture or fire. It was people. Their culture taught that winter was a collective battle. If one person shivered, everyone felt it. If one home weakened, all were at risk. And so warmth became shared. A woman would bring hot stones wrapped in cloth to an elderly neighbor. Men carried torches at night to guide others through the storm. Children delivered warm broth to anyone too ill to walk. This wasn't charity, it was survival instinct. Their unity produced a warmth no winter could ever smother. And in those long, dark nights, something almost magical happened. They grew stronger. Winter forged them. It taught patience, discipline, and the skill to spot weakness before it became disaster. It sharpened their senses. It taught them to read the patterns of wind, snow, and sky. And through it all, their lives inside those glowing longhouses became a testament to human resilience. They didn't merely endure winter. They mastered it. And they passed that mastery down through generations, like sacred fire. As the night wore on, and the fire throbbed with low red light, a quiet peace settled over every Viking village. Outside, the aurora danced across the sky. Stars glittered like frost. Wolves howled from distant ridges. But the Viking people slept in warmth, safe, wrapped in layers of tradition, design, discipline, community, and an unbreakable bond with the land. And that, more than anything, is why Viking villages never froze, even in the most brutal Arctic winters the world has ever seen. And so the men worked in shifts, carving channels beneath the snowdrifts so wind could blow through and prevent ice from forming solid blocks around the farmstead. These channels created a strange sound on stormy nights, a deep humming, almost like a distant horn, something travelers often mistook for the voices of ancient gods calling across the frozen valleys. But for the Vikings, it was simply the voice of survival, the whisper of warm air being pulled through a living system they had built with their own hands. Even indoors, their winter strategies were far more advanced than most civilizations of the era. The longhouses were designed to breathe, wooden walls angled ever so slightly, roof beams set to let smoke rise but not escape too quickly, and floors layered with crushed pine resin mixed with peat that held heat for astonishing lengths of time. A longhouse could stay warm for an entire night from a single evening fire, even when the outside temperature dropped so low that moisture in the air crystallized instantly. Their beds were another marvel. Instead of lying directly on hay, which froze quickly, Vikings layered their bedding with alternating materials, feathers for insulation, wool for heat trapping, and a final top layer of animal skins, usually turned inward so the fur touched their bodies. A person could crawl into such a bed and feel warmth spreading across them within minutes, even if they had spent the day trekking through snow deep enough to swallow entire fences. But the true secret was understanding the human body. The Vikings rarely slept alone in winter, not because of romance, but because they understood that shared body heat meant survival. Entire families slept side by side, sometimes even with their livestock resting in the adjoining room. The animals produced constant heat, and the slight warmth drifting through the wooden divider walls kept the entire structure from freezing. Even so, winter was relentless. Storms could rage for days. Snow could pile higher than a fully grown man. And there were nights when the wind was so vicious it shook the longhouses like ships at sea. On such nights, elders told stories, not just to pass the time, but to remind everyone that they came from generations who had survived far worse. Stories of journeys across frozen oceans, of discovering new lands beyond the horizon, or of the time when a single Viking village lit a fire so massive that the entire fjord reflected red as if the skies themselves were burning. Yet, even in those brutal moments, the villages didn't freeze. Because everything about them, from the placement of the houses to the design of the roofs, was created with intention. Snow wasn't their enemy, it was part of their shield. The positioning of villages was never random. Vikings chose spots where natural formations, such as rocky cliffs or dense forests, acted as buffers against the northern winds. They studied wind patterns long before building a settlement. Some villages were placed in bowl-shaped valleys where cold air would settle lower than the houses, leaving the living spaces comparatively warmer. Others were built near geothermal hotspots, where heated water flowed beneath the earth like veins of fire. Children learned this knowledge early. By the age of 10, a Viking child already knew how to check the thickness of river ice, understand cloud movement, and predict incoming storms simply by feeling changes in humidity. Survival wasn't a skill, it was a culture. Even their clothing showed this deep knowledge. Viking winter garments weren't bulky, they were layered cleverly. Thin inner tunics of soft wool absorbed sweat and kept the skin dry. Outer layers were windproof, often made from tightly woven wool treated with beeswax or animal fat to repel moisture. And for extreme cold, they wrapped themselves in cloaks made of wolf or bear fur, the same way nature had prepared those animals to survive the Arctic. Fire itself was treated with respect, almost like a deity. Each household kept an ember burning at all times, hidden in a small clay container lined with moss. No matter how violent the winter became, they never let the flame die. They also believed winter revealed the true strength of a community. When storms sealed entire valleys under thick ice, neighbors relied on one another in ways that summer never demanded. If a roof began to sag under the weight of snow, men from surrounding homes rushed in with poles and ropes. If a family's firewood ran low, others shared their supply, knowing the favor would be returned one day. In the Viking world, survival wasn't individual, it was shared. And this sense of unity created warmth even when the temperature around them plummeted to the coldest depths. During long winter nights, the hearth became the center of everything. Children gathered around the fire to hear sagas from elders, tales of gods, giants, sea monsters, and heroic voyages across unknown seas. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were teaching tools. Each saga hid lessons about navigating storms, reading the stars, or understanding the dangerous moods of the ocean. Without realizing it, children absorbed knowledge that would keep them alive when they grew up and faced the same brutal winters their ancestors had endured. The firelight also played tricks on the walls. Shadows stretched across carved wooden beams painted with runes. Smoke curled toward the vent in the center of the roof, carrying scents of cooking meat, pine resin, and burning peat. The atmosphere inside a Viking longhouse during winter was unlike anything else in the ancient world, cozy, warm, and alive, even when deathly cold surrounded them outside. The interior structure of a longhouse contributed greatly to its warmth. The buildings were long and narrow, allowing heat to circulate easily from one end to the other. Large fireplaces built in the center radiated heat outward, warming the benches where families slept. And along the walls, woven tapestries hung not just for decoration but to trap heat and block drafts. These textiles, often dyed with natural pigments and embroidered with symbols of protection, created an additional insulating layer that kept the frigid air at bay. Even the floors helped maintain warmth. Vikings filled the cracks between planks with moss, clay, and animal fat, creating a nearly airtight seal. Above that, thick mats made from reeds and straw formed a soft surface that insulated feet from the cold earth. For homes built partially underground, the natural insulation of soil added another layer of protection, keeping the temperature stable even when blizzards howled outside. But their brilliance extended far beyond the walls of their homes. They used the landscape itself as a survival tool. Many Viking villages were built near forests that provided not just wood, but natural windbreaks. Trees reduced the force of winter storms, preventing snow from piling directly against the longhouses. Some settlements were built facing the rising sun so that the first light of dawn warmed the wooden walls. They even had a practice of creating snow barriers around their villages. By piling snow strategically, yes, snow itself, they built temporary walls that redirected wind and controlled drifting. Modern engineers call this snow fencing, but Vikings mastered it 1,000 years before the term existed. Their food storage methods were equally impressive. Underground pits lined with stone kept vegetables from freezing, and smoked meat stored in lofts above the hearth remained edible for months. Fish hung from rafters, drying gently in the warm smoke. Butter and cheese were packed tightly in barrels and placed near the warmest parts of the home. The result? Even in the worst winters, Viking families never starved. And all the while, outside, the world looked completely different. Frozen waterfalls hung like crystal towers. Lakes transformed into mirrors of solid ice. The sky glowed with shifting colors, green, purple, and gold, dancing in the darkness like living spirits. The Vikings called this the Aurora Borealis, and to them, it was a sign that the gods were watching over the world even during its coldest months. Yet despite the beauty, winter could be deadly. Travelers who took a wrong turn in a snowstorm sometimes vanished without a trace. Ships caught in sudden freezes became trapped in ice, their crews stranded miles from home. Wolves came closer to the villages, driven by hunger. But the Vikings were ready. They knew the dangers better than anyone, and they built their world to survive them. Their clothing, crafted from layered wool, fur, and leather, formed a kind of wearable shelter. Boots lined with rabbit fur kept toes from freezing. Gloves made from deer hide protected hands during long labor outdoors. Their cloaks, fastened with metal brooches, doubled as blankets during sleep. These garments were so effective that modern Arctic explorers have studied them to understand how ancient peoples survived extreme climates without synthetic materials. Night after night, season after season, the Viking world endured. And from inside their warm, glowing longhouses, families listened to the distant cry of the wind, feeling safe, protected, and united. The secret wasn't one thing, it was everything. A system of knowledge passed down through generations. A culture built around winter rather than fighting it. Homes designed with precision. Communities bound by trust. Clothing engineered for survival. Food stored with the wisdom of centuries. This is why Viking villages never froze, even when the Arctic winter tried its hardest to break them. But there was something deeper, something almost invisible, that helped Viking villages stay warm through winters that should have killed them. It was their uncanny ability to read nature long before any storm arrived. A Viking farmer could walk outside, sniff the air, and know that snow would fall within hours. A fisher could feel the tension in the wind coming off the fjord and predict if the water would freeze faster than usual. These instincts were sharpened through generations, passed down like tools, each winter teaching the next one how to survive better. Their understanding of ice was legendary. Vikings could tell the thickness of a frozen lake not by tapping it, but by listening. When ice formed, it produced a low echoing hum that changed with thickness. If it sounded too sharp, they avoided it. If it rumbled deeply, they knew it was solid enough to cross, even with a loaded sled. This knowledge saved countless lives during hunting trips and long winter migrations. And yet, despite their skills, winter still found ways to test them. There were stories of winters so harsh that entire fjords froze from shore to shore. Ships that once sailed freely became trapped like insects in amber. Children, bundled in fur, played on the solid surfaces where their families once rode. These rare winters were legendary, talked about for decades afterward. Yet even then, Viking villages didn't freeze through. Because when everything else failed, they adapted. If a river froze solid, they cut trenches into the ice to ensure water still flowed underneath for livestock. If a storm lasted too long, they moved families into communal longhouses where multiple hearths created a single massive bubble of heat. If the snow blocked every path, they built raised walkways from logs and branches so they could move between homes without sinking waist deep. At times, entire villages reshaped themselves for survival. Houses closest to the sea acted as wind shields for those behind them. Barns and storage huts were reinforced with extra layers of sod or pine branches. Children helped by packing snow tightly around the base of longhouses, a trick that actually insulated the walls like a natural jacket. They also crafted tools suited for winter. Long-handled axes made it easier to chop frozen wood. Skis carved from spruce allowed them to travel across deep snow faster than any enemy or predator. Snowshoes, shaped like woven circles, let them walk long distances without exhausting themselves. These inventions weren't luxuries, they were lifelines. Even their animals played a role in warmth. Cattle and goats were kept close to the longhouses, separated only by thin wooden walls. Their combined body heat warmed the air enough that ice rarely formed inside the barns. Chickens and smaller animals huddled near hearths during the coldest nights. Nothing in a Viking village was wasted. Everything helped sustain life. But what truly set them apart was their spirit. Winter in the Viking world wasn't only a season, it was a teacher, a rival, a test of will. And the people who survived it didn't resent the cold, they respected it. They saw beauty in the silence of snowy forests, and strength in the icy waves that crashed against their fjords. Even on the darkest nights, when the winds screamed like living creatures, they found comfort in knowing they were part of a culture that had mastered what others feared. During midwinter celebrations, entire villages gathered around massive bonfires that blazed for hours. Sparks shot into the sky like tiny stars fleeing into the night. The warmth reached even the houses at the edge of the settlement. People feasted, sang, and told stories of ancient heroes. They celebrated not just the return of light, but their own endurance. Every winter survived was a victory. And despite the brutal conditions, Viking winters also held moments of quiet magic. The crunch of snow under boots. The faint glow of torches guiding travelers home. The soft clatter of icicles falling from roofs. And above all, the northern lights, shimmering, twisting, filling the sky with colors that seemed alive. Vikings believed these lights were the reflections of Valkyries' shields as they rode across the heavens. To them, the lights meant protection, a reminder that they were not alone even in the deepest cold. This powerful blend of belief, engineering, tradition, and instinct created something extraordinary, villages that could survive Arctic winters without freezing, without collapsing, without losing hope. Even centuries later, archaeologists still uncover Viking longhouses where fire pits remain charred but intact, where layers of insulation still cling to the walls, where woven tapestries survived beneath collapsed roofs. And they marvel at how such ancient structures maintained warmth in places that even modern engineers consider extreme. The truth is simple: Viking villages didn't survive winter. They conquered it. There were winters so dark that the sun barely surfaced above the horizon, casting only a faint blue glow across the snow-covered world. During these months, the longhouses became sanctuaries of sound and warmth. The crackling of the hearth, the rumble of voices sharing stories, the steady rhythm of craftsmen carving wood or repairing tools, these sounds wrapped around the villagers like blankets. Outside, the world was silent, muffled by thick layers of snow that absorbed every echo. But inside, life thrived. Women spun wool into yarn while seated near the fire, their fingers moving quickly to keep the cold from stiffening their joints. Men mended fishing nets, sharpened blades, or repaired sleds. Children practiced carving simple runes on small wooden pieces, learning the ancient symbols one by one. Everything done in winter prepared the community for spring, and everyone knew their role. This constant activity kept the cold from creeping into their bones and kept their spirits alive. In the evenings, families shared meals rich enough to sustain them through long nights. Stews simmered with root vegetables, dried fish, and chunks of meat. Flatbreads made from barley flour warmed in clay ovens. Butter melted into the broth, adding calories their bodies desperately needed. The steam rising from these bowls filled the room with the smell of comfort and nourishment. Every bite was energy for survival. At times, the howling wind was so strong that it rattled the wooden beams of the longhouses, making the children inch closer to their parents. But the adults knew the buildings were sound. Each longhouse had been constructed using interlocking timber frames that could flex slightly during heavy storms without breaking. This engineering, paired with the thick turf roofs, made their homes strong enough to withstand even the fiercest tempests. And when the storms grew unbearable, the entire village moved into a kind of winter rhythm, a shared understanding that came from centuries of facing nature's harshness. They closed shutters, reinforced doors with extra planks, and kept torches lit inside to provide comfort. They checked on elderly neighbors, brought them food, and reassured them with warm voices. Loneliness could be as deadly as cold, and Vikings made sure no one faced it alone. But winter didn't only test their strength, it revealed their ingenuity. For example, when snow piled too high around the houses, blocking the entrances, they used sleds as temporary steps. If the smoke holes in the roof became clogged with ice, they used long poles to break it free. When icicles sealed doors shut, they melted them slowly with heated stones rather than risking breaking the wood. Every problem had a solution rooted in ancient wisdom. And there was beauty in this hardship, too. When the storms cleared, silence returned, a pure, untouched quiet that felt like the world had been washed clean. Snow stretched endlessly, glistening under the faint sunlight. The trees stood dressed in white. Smoke curled from longhouse chimneys in thin, elegant trails, marking the presence of life amidst an otherwise frozen world. Even the animals seemed calmer after a storm, stepping carefully, their breath forming little clouds in the cold air. Vikings often took these moments to venture outside and assess the damage. They shoveled pathways, checked roofs for weak points, and gathered firewood blown loose by the wind. Children played on freshly fallen snow, making trails with their boots or sliding down small hills on wooden boards. Their laughter echoed across the village, reminding everyone that life still thrived even in the coldest months. Some families kept domesticated dogs that helped track lost livestock or warn of predators lurking too close. These dogs, often large and thick-furred, were valued not just as helpers but as companions. On the coldest nights, a dog might sleep near the foot of a child's bed, providing extra warmth. Even the animals became part of the communal survival system. Inside the longhouses, nights grew long, so long that they often felt endless. But the Vikings used the darkness wisely. They crafted jewelry, carved wooden figurines, wrote runes on stones, and planned upcoming voyages. Winter was a time to reflect, to strengthen bonds, to prepare for future battles and journeys. The firelight made shadows dance on the walls as conversations drifted lazily from one topic to another. Yet no matter how peaceful the longhouse felt, winter always lurked just outside. Frost crept up the window frames, forming intricate patterns that looked like frozen forests. The cold pressed against the doors, searching for weaknesses. But year after year, winter failed to break through. For Vikings, the secret wasn't magic or luck. It was knowledge. It was preparation. It was unity. And this unity extended beyond humans. Ravens circled the skies above villages, searching for scraps. Wolves howled from distant hills, their cries echoing across frozen valleys. The Vikings listened to these sounds as part of nature's language. They knew how to interpret each one. A wolf's howl might warn of deep cold approaching. A raven's flight pattern might signal a break in the storm. Nature spoke constantly. Vikings simply listened better than most. But perhaps the most incredible part of their survival was not what they built or wore, but what they believed. The cold, to them, wasn't an enemy. It was a force of the world, something ancient and respected. This philosophy allowed them to face winter with courage instead of fear. They taught their children not to curse the frost, but to admire the strength it required to endure it. They told stories of legendary warriors who traveled across frozen oceans to discover new lands. They spoke of gods who ruled the wind, snow, and ice, gods who rewarded bravery and punished foolishness. This mindset created people who didn't panic when the temperature dropped. They adjusted. They adapted. They endured. And that endurance made their villages almost impossible to freeze. Even today, when archaeologists explore former Viking settlements deep in the Arctic Circle, they find evidence of warmth, charcoal pits, preserved wool fibers, even remnants of dried fish that stayed edible for centuries. These discoveries prove what the sagas always claimed: Viking villages were designed not just to survive winter, but to defy it. As winter reached its final stretch, the Viking world shifted once again. The cold was still brutal, the nights still long, but a quiet change began to ripple through the land. The air, though icy, carried a faint whisper of moisture. The snow softened ever so slightly underfoot. Ravens circled a little higher, sensing something ancient in the wind. Even the children noticed the difference. Their breath didn't crystallize quite as sharply, and the cold didn't bite with the same merciless edge. Inside the longhouses, the fires still burned, but people began to speak more frequently of spring. Not because they were weary, Vikings rarely complained about winter, but because they knew what spring meant: voyages, new harvests, repairing ships, gathering herbs, trading with distant clans. Winter had held them close for months, binding the village in warmth and unity. But spring would release them back into the world. Yet before the thaw arrived, the cold tried one final time to break them. A storm unlike anything the younger generation had ever seen swept across the valley. The wind didn't howl, it roared. Snow didn't fall, it swarmed like white sand in a desert storm. Visibility dropped to nothing. The world outside became a swirling void. Trees bent dangerously, branches snapping like brittle bones. Even the longhouses groaned under the pressure, their wooden frames trembling as if gripping the earth itself to stay upright. But no one inside panicked. Because they had prepared for this. They always did. Families moved quickly but calmly, reinforcing support beams, piling extra firewood near the hearth, sealing door frames with thick rolls of wool. Elders murmured old prayers while sharpening axes. Children sat wrapped in furs, wide-eyed but unafraid, because every adult around them radiated confidence. Through the storm's fury, the longhouses glowed like beacons. Firelight flickered through cracks, casting golden lines across the snow outside. Smoke rose steadily through roof vents that had been designed to remain open even during the worst blizzards. The heat inside remained steady, trapped by centuries of engineering wisdom and countless layers of insulation. Hours passed. Then a day. Then nearly two. But when the storm finally broke, when the winds slowly died and the snow settled like powdered glass across the landscape, the Viking village stood firm, untouched, unbroken, unshaken. Children were the first to run outside, laughing as they plunged into the fresh snow. Men and women followed, their boots crunching loudly as they surveyed the aftermath. Trees leaned, fences vanished, and snowdrifts reached higher than the roofs. But the village itself, the heart of the community, remained alive and warm. They cleaned slowly but methodically. They dug out paths. They checked on barns and livestock. They climbed onto roofs to clear heavy snow.